Number 8. Bay of Pigs. Cuban revolutionary and dictator Fidel Castro rose to power in 1959 during the Cold War. Knowing he had an amicable relationship with the communist Soviet leader, Nikita Khrushchev, the U.S. government was eager to help overthrow Castro any way possible. The Central Intelligence Agency, or the CIA, hatched a plot to train 1,200 Cuban exiles for an invasion into the country. The agency believed that Cuban citizens and factions of its military would support the campaign. President John F. Kennedy approved the plan in 1961. The U.S. government tried to keep the mission a secret, but it became a hot topic of conversation among Cuban exiles in Miami. Castro learned of the secret plan with plenty of time to prepare. In April of 1961, American-sponsored bombers that were painted to look like Cuban military aircrafts missed several targets. Castro's Air Force was left mostly intact, and the media soon exposed the U.S. government's support for the invasion. JFK canceled a second airstrike, but green-lighted plans for a Cuban exile force to attack Castro's military. The brigade immediately encountered heavy fire upon landing at the Bay of Pigs. 2 ships were sunk, half of the exiles' air support was shot down, and ground forces were hindered by wet equipment and a lack of ammunition. JFK sent American fighter planes to aid the failing invasion, but they arrived late and were shot down by the Cuban military. Meanwhile, Castro sent 20,000 troops toward the beach. Over 100 of the exiles were killed, and most that were left surrendered. The Bay of Pigs invasion backfired miserably and helped to solidify Castro's power. He gained support amongst Cuban citizens and throughout Latin America by accusing the Americans of being imperialist bullies. The ordeal was also a major selling point in his appeal to the Soviet Union for additional financial aid. Relations between the U.S. and Cuba remain rocky to this day. President Barack Obama attempted to restore diplomatic ties, but many of these reforms were reversed during the Trump administration. For now, the future of the relationship between the two countries remains uncertain. Number 7. The Battle of Agincourt. The 100 Years' War was a lengthy conflict between England and France that lasted from 1337 to 1453. Long story short, the war revolved mainly around disputed claims to the French throne. One of France's biggest losses came at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415. Negotiations with the French kingdom had failed to come to a resolution after several decades of relative peace, and King Henry V of England led 11,000 troops into northern France. They were exhausted and vastly outnumbered by the 20,000 French soldiers they came face to face with at Agincourt. Equipped with longbows, English archers shot arrows at the French forces as they struggled to advance across the battlefield in heavy armor. The French had grossly miscalculated the effectiveness of the English longbows. They tried to charge at the archers, but were met by a line of pointed stakes that had been put down to protect the English soldiers. By then, the French were severely weakened and fighting a losing battle. Henry ordered his men to charge at the enemy with axes and swords. They easily defeated the French, who suffered 6,000 losses compared to just 400 English casualties. The English had defeated the odds in their victory at Agincourt and was a major stepping stone towards securing Henry V's ascension to the French throne 5 years later. Number 6. The Battle of Karanshabesh. We all know that drinking too much alcohol can lead to bad decisions, right? The Austrian army learned this lesson the hard way in 1788 by making drunken mistakes that proved fatal at the Battle of Karanshabesh. The skirmish happened during the Austro-Turkish War, also known as the Habsburg-Ottoman War, which pitted the Austrians and the Ottoman Empire against each other. At the time, the two sides were battling for control of the Danube River in what is now Romania. One night, a group of Austrian cavalrymen, or hussars, went out scouting for Ottoman soldiers. They came across a group of Romani travelers, commonly called gypsies, who offered to sell them some schnapps. The troops eagerly indulged. A short while later, some Austrian infantrymen saw that there was a party going on and demanded some alcohol. The cavalrymen who arrived there before them refused to share, and the disagreement erupted into gunfire. As the two groups shot at each other despite being from the same army, someone yelled, "Turks! Turks!" The hussars fled back towards their camp. An officer heard them coming and, assuming they were Ottoman soldiers, ordered his troops to attack them. Unable to see the approaching group under the cover of night, they complied. Over 1,000 Austrians died at the hands of their own army during the confused skirmish. The chaos worked to the advantage of the Ottomans, who easily took Karanshabush when they arrived 2 days later. Number 5. The failed F-35. The F-35 was supposed to be the world's most advanced stealth fighter jet. It was developed to replace outdated Cold War-era fighter jets by Lockheed Martin in partnership with the US government and several other allies. The program's official website describes the F-35 as the world's most survivable and lethal fighter aircraft. It goes on to say that the project is responsible for tens of thousands of high-paying jobs throughout the globe. Sounds like a good deal, right? Well, some things sound better than they actually are, and the F-35 may just be a shining example of this. Earlier this year, Forbes reported that the project was essentially a failure. The F-35 was intended to be lightweight and affordable, but the technology that was added to the design over the years made it almost too heavy. Not only was the project self-defeating, the aircraft was proven to be unreliable. It's also high maintenance and extremely costly, with each jet costing around $100 million. This type of fighter jet is not ideal for day-to-day use, according to Air Force Chief of Staff General Charles Brown, Jr. So there's still a need for a lightweight aircraft that functions for what he calls low-end operations, which is what the F-35 was supposed to be. Simply put, the jet's designers over-equipped it in an effort to maximize its capabilities. While the F-35 is useful for some things, it's a failure in the sense that it left the military's original goal unfulfilled. Officials are currently trying to decide if and how it's possible to design and build an affordable, lightweight fighter jet. Should they repeat the same mistakes that happened with the F-35, it could amount even more time and money spent on repeating history. What do you think of these military disasters so far? Let us know in the comments below, and if you're liking this video, be sure to hit the thumbs up and subscribe button if you haven't already. Number 4. Napoleon's invasion of Russia. Napoleon Bonaparte assembled the largest army in the history of warfare before invading Russia in 1812. With as many as 685,000 soldiers from all over Europe under his command, the military leader's Grande Armée was surely a formidable force. In June of that year, he led the troops through Poland and into Russia with the goal of forcing Tsar Alexander to rejoin the continental blockade of the United Kingdom. This was a trading embargo that Napoleon had enacted against the British and that Alexander had stopped cooperating with. Much to Napoleon's surprise, the Russians refused to negotiate. Instead, they pulled back and let the intruders take the city of Vilna. Meanwhile, bad weather killed many of Napoleon's troops, while others deserted to plunder and in search of food. As the summer dragged on, the Russians continued to retreat, setting fire to buildings, settlements, and crops to prevent them from falling into French hands. The Grande Armée grew increasingly weak as its soldiers suffered from disease and oppressive heat and died in battle. French forces eventually reached Moscow, only to find it burning, with most of its residents gone and little food left behind. By then, winter was approaching. Knowing his soldiers would not survive the harsh cold, Napoleon led his 100,000 surviving soldiers out of the city. Along the way, Russian forces attacked. Winter came early and food was scarce. As a result, thousands more died. Several thousand wounded soldiers were left behind. Russia, Sweden, Austria, and Prussia rejoined the British fight against the French, and in early 1814, Paris was captured. Napoleon attempted to regain power, but he soon learned that his glory days were over. Number 3. Titanburg Forest. In the year 9 AD, a Roman general named Publius Quinctilius Varus led 3 legions of soldiers into the Titanburg Forest of what is now Germany. There, they suffered what some historians consider to be Rome's greatest defeat, and in hindsight, the reasons behind this devastating blow were painfully obvious. Not only was Varus unfamiliar with the territory, he had ignored the advice of German noblemen who forewarned him of a planned uprising by his trusted advisor, Arminius. Arminius had somehow managed to secretly facilitate an alliance of Germanic tribes who had traditionally been enemies with one another. He told Varus that there was a local rebellion, which was a lie, prompting the general to take a shortcut through the Titanburg Forest to put a stop to the fictional uprising. Varus relied on Arminius to direct him through the woods, At some point, Arminius said he was going to search for Germanic troops willing to support the Roman campaign. Instead, he led his troops into a series of attacks against the Romans. An estimated 15,000 to 20,000 Roman soldiers were killed, including Varus. Others were taken for ransom or forced into slavery. Historians blame Varus' arrogance and ignorance for the defeat. Simply put, he failed to take proper precautions, like sending scouts into the forest ahead of the main force. He underestimated Arminius' capabilities, and he ignored the glaringly obvious warning signs that something really bad was about to happen. Number 2. Blackburn Buccaneer. This image shows a British combat strike aircraft being dropped off a ship and into the waves below. Known as the Blackburn Buccaneer, the plane was designed during the 1950s as a low-altitude aircraft capable of attacking Soviet ships. The aircraft was ahead of its time, and the project was kept top secret for the first few years. A Reddit user wrote that the plane in the picture was deliberately tossed into the water while filming a training video. While there's very little other information available about it, it's hard not to think that it made sense to chuck the aircraft. But why? Serious accidents began to happen while the Blackburn Buccaneer was still in its design and testing stages. In 1959, an aircraft stalled at 10,000 feet. The crew ejected shortly before it hit the ground, but sadly, they all died. Then, in 1960, a pilot became disoriented while flying the prototype. He and another crew member ejected, and thankfully, they managed to survive. After the Blackburn Buccaneer entered into service for the Royal Navy in 1962, another entire crew lost their lives when the plane stalled mid-flight. To solve the problem, the British military had a newer version designed with bigger engines. But why were so many unfortunate accidents happening? Was it cursed? The fleet fell into the hands of the Royal Air Force in 1978. Just 2 years later, however, a Blackburn Buccaneer got into another accident. The damage revealed metal fatigue problems. Many of the planes were scrapped, reducing the fleet to just 60 aircraft. When the Cold War ended, the strength of the RAF was reduced, and several Blackburn Buccaneers were forced into early retirement, with just a handful remaining in use until 1944. While the aircraft was not a complete failure, systematic design flaws claimed numerous lives during its early years. Sadly, several people tragically paid with their lives before these problems were fixed, and this definitely qualifies as a major military blunder. And number 1, Operation Barbarossa. Operation Barbarossa was the codename that the Nazis used for their invasion of the Soviet Union in 1941. Their plan was to conquer Russia before the harsh winter set in. Adolf Hitler was confident that his forces would achieve a quick victory. In June of that year, 3 million German and Axis troops invaded the Soviet Union. The Red Army was massive, but unprepared for the attack. Not only had Joseph Stalin ignored warning signs about it, his forces were poorly trained. Over 1,000 Soviet aircraft were shot down on the first day alone. In the coming days, the Germans took millions of Red Army soldiers as prisoners. Armed SS death squads, known as the Einsatzgruppen, followed behind the army and slaughtered civilians en masse. Despite their losses, the Red Army fiercely resisted, and their fighting spirit took an immense toll on the Nazis. The Soviets launched counterattacks, slowing the Germans' advance towards Moscow. Hitler ordered the military to focus on seizing other cities, giving the Red Army time to prepare for Moscow's defense. The Germans were eventually ordered to head back towards Moscow and became stuck outside of the city during Rasputitsa, a time of year when unpaved roads become muddy and difficult to travel on. Already in a vulnerable position, the Nazis then encountered the strengthened Red Army. The Soviets defeated the Germans with help from Siberian forces. By then, winter was approaching, and in December of 1941, the Red Army launched a counterattack, forcing the Nazis to retreat. Over 1 million German and Axis soldiers died during Operation Barbarossa, which failed its goal of forcing the Soviet Union into submission. Hitler blamed the winter weather for the failure, but experts say that the Nazis failed to plan for long distances and rough terrain while underestimating the Red Army's strength. Hitler attempted to take the Soviet Union again the following year, and he once again failed. Thanks for watching. Which of these disasters do you think was the most avoidable? Let us know in the comments below, and be sure to subscribe. See you next time.